Hey everyone, the story for today is the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Now Joseph has been sold into slavery by his brothers, and he's found himself in Potiphar's house down in Egypt as a slave. Now Potiphar was the captain of the guard. That means he was responsible for carrying out Pharaoh's orders. He was the one responsible for executions. So you could say that Joseph really had to watch himself. Joseph really had to give his best so that he didn't find himself on the bad side of Potiphar. Now, God had blessed Joseph so much that it ended up blessing Potiphar, and it blessed everything that Potiphar owned. So Potiphar ended up putting Joseph in charge of his entire household. Now, one day Potiphar's wife decided that she wanted a little piece of Joseph. So she comes to Joseph and she tries to take advantage of him. Maybe that's the best way to put it. Joseph says, "No, absolutely not. That's not right." And Joseph takes off running. He tries to put as much space between him and Potiphar's wife as possible. Now, in the meantime, Potiphar's wife is thinking to herself, well, I've got to come up with a story. And she decides that she's going to tell the story where it's Joseph who tried to take advantage of her. So she tells this to Potiphar. Of course, Potiphar gets angry, Potiphar gets upset, and by some miracle, Potiphar doesn't kill Joseph. He doesn't execute him on the spot. Instead, Potiphar puts Joseph in the Pharaoh's prison. Now, while Joseph is in Pharaoh's prison, he ends up finding favor with the prison warden, and the warden ends up putting Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners. Now, there are a lot of different things that you could really take away from this particular story. You could talk about how bearing false witness against people can really destroy their lives, or you could talk about speaking truth to power. Or maybe there's something else in this story. Now, every good story has a through line, and a through line are the main ideas. It's the idea or the theme that carries the story from beginning to end. And if there were a through line for Joseph's story, it would be one of human suffering. Joseph is thrown in a pit by his brothers, and then he's sold into slavery by his brothers. And as a slave, he gets accused of trying to hurt someone or take advantage of someone, and he finds himself in prison, and in prison he ends up finding himself on the short end of Pharaoh's stick. He finds out that if he doesn't interpret a dream right, Pharaoh's going to have him killed. Now, if you know the whole story of Joseph, you know that in the very end, it's his brothers who come back to him begging for mercy, begging that Joseph will take care of them. And maybe you could say that the through line of this particular story is that human suffering gives birth to something greater. Maybe that's the entire through line of this entire story. Maybe that's the through line of Joseph's story. And in fact, he does say to his brothers, what you meant to do to harm me, God used for my good, and really for our good. Now, this story reminds me of another story, and it makes me think that this story, Joseph's life, his entire life, is just a mini story that supports the through line of God's story. I immediately think about Christ on the cross and his suffering on the cross, and how Jesus' suffering on the cross was the birth pains or the labor pains of something coming that was so much greater.